The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Kensington Palace as two young voices echoed through the corridors. Prince George, now 12 years old, sat at the grand piano in the music room, his fingers dancing across the keys with surprising skill. Across from him, 9-year-old Princess Charlotte held a violin, her bow moving gracefully as she played a melody that seemed to come straight from her heart. What started as simple music lessons to keep the royal children occupied had transformed into something extraordinary. The palace staff stopped their morning duties to listen whenever the children practiced. News of their remarkable talent had begun to spread beyond the palace walls, catching the attention of renowned musicians and conductors across Britain. But this is not just a story about two privileged children learning instruments. This is the true account of how Prince George and Princess Charlotte discovered their passion for music, overcame countless challenges, and eventually stood before thousands of people as they led one of Britain's most prestigious orchestras. It's a story of sibling rivalry that turned into partnership, of royal duty clashing with artistic dreams, and of two young souls who found their voice through the universal language of music. Their journey would take them from the quiet music room of Kensington Palace to the grand stages of concert halls, from private tutors to working alongside world-famous musicians. Along the way, they would face criticism, doubt, and the enormous pressure that comes with being royal children in the public eye. They would also discover that sometimes the greatest gifts come not from being born in a privilege, but from the courage to pursue your dreams despite everyone watching. This is their story, told exactly as it happened, capturing every triumph, every setback, and every moment that shaped two young royals into the musical leaders they never expected to become. The idea came to Catherine, Princess of Wales, during a particularly quiet Tuesday afternoon in March 2024. Prince George had been restless lately, struggling to focus on his regular lessons, while Princess Charlotte seemed to have endless energy that needed a proper outlet. Both children had shown interest when they heard music playing around the palace, but neither had any formal training. Catherine remembered her own childhood piano lessons, how music had provided her with a sense of calm and accomplishment that nothing else could match. She discussed the idea with Prince William during their evening walk through the palace gardens. They both agreed that music lessons might be exactly what the children needed, not just for entertainment, but for personal development and discipline. The search for the right music teacher took several weeks. The palace staff contacted the Royal Academy of Music, the Royal College of Music, and several private institutions. They needed someone who could handle teaching royal children while maintaining the highest standards of musical education. The teacher would also need to be discreet, reliable, and capable of adapting to the unique circumstances of teaching within the royal household. Professor Margaret Thompson, a distinguished pianist and music educator from the Royal Academy of Music, was eventually selected for the position. At 62 years old, she had spent 4 decades teaching music to students from all walks of life, including several children from prominent families. Her reputation for patience, excellence, and ability to inspire young musicians made her the perfect choice for the royal children. The first meeting took place in early April 2024. Professor Thompson arrived at Kensington Palace carrying 2 small instrument cases and a folder full of beginner music sheets. She was nervous, despite her years of experience, because teaching royal children came with pressures she had never faced before. The media attention, the expectations, and the formal protocol all added layers of complexity to what should be a simple music lesson. Prince George and Princess Charlotte were initially shy when they met Professor Thompson. They had been told they would be starting music lessons, but neither child fully understood what that meant. George, being the older sibling, spoke first, asking if he would have to perform for important people. Charlotte wanted to know if she could choose her own instrument or if one would be chosen for her. Professor Thompson immediately put both children at ease by explaining that music was about personal expression and enjoyment, not about performing for others unless they wanted to. She brought out a small keyboard and a child-sized violin, explaining that they would start with basic lessons to see which instruments appealed to each child. There would be no pressure, no immediate expectations, and no requirements to perform until they felt ready and confident. The first lesson was scheduled for the following Wednesday morning. The palace staff prepared the small music room on the second floor, ensuring it had proper lighting, comfortable seating, and space for both instruments. The room had excellent acoustics due to its high ceilings and hardwood floors, making it perfect for music instruction and practice. When Wednesday arrived, both children were excited but nervous. George had spent the previous evening asking his parents questions about music theory, wanting to understand the technical aspects before he even touched an instrument. Charlotte, on the other hand, had been humming melodies and asking if she could learn to play songs she heard on the radio. Professor Thompson began the lesson by explaining the basics of music, using simple terms that both children could understand. She talked about rhythm by having them clap along to different beats, explain melody by singing simple scales, and introduced the concept of harmony by playing basic chord progressions on her portable keyboard. Both children were immediately engaged. George showed particular interest in understanding how the piano keys corresponded to musical notes, while Charlotte was fascinated by the way the violin could create different sounds depending on how the bow was moved across the strings. Their different approaches to learning music were already becoming apparent, even in this first lesson. The lesson lasted for 45 minutes, which Professor Thompson had determined would be the optimal length for maintaining the children's attention without overwhelming them. By the end of the session, both George and Charlotte had successfully played their first few notes. George managed to play a simple scale on the piano, while Charlotte learned to hold the violin properly and draw the bow across the strings to create clear, pleasant sounds. Catherine and William observed the lesson from a distance, pleased to see their children so engaged and enthusiastic about learning something completely new. They could see that Professor Thompson had the right approach, balancing instruction with encouragement and making the experience enjoyable rather than stressful. After the lesson, both children immediately asked when they could have their next session. George wanted to practice what he had learned, while Charlotte asked if she could try playing a simple song by the following week. Their enthusiasm confirmed that the decision to introduce music lessons had been the right choice. Professor Thompson left that day feeling optimistic about the potential she saw in both children. George demonstrated strong analytical thinking and showed interest in understanding the theoretical foundation of music, while Charlotte displayed natural musical intuition and an ear for melody that impressed the experienced teacher. The palace staff were also pleased with how smoothly the first lesson had gone. The security arrangements had worked well, Professor Thompson had arrived and departed without any issues, and the children had clearly enjoyed the experience. Plans were made to continue with weekly lessons and to gradually introduce more advanced concepts as the children progressed. Over the following weeks, the music lessons became a regular and anticipated part of the children's schedule. Both George and Charlotte practiced between lessons, with palace staff often hearing piano melodies or violin scales echoing through the corridors during quiet afternoon hours. George's approach to learning piano was methodical and structured. He wanted to understand the reasoning behind each technique before attempting to play. He studied music theory with the same intensity he applied to his other academic subjects, asking detailed questions about chord structures, key signatures, and compositional techniques. His progress was steady and consistent, building a solid foundation of musical knowledge alongside his developing keyboard skills. Charlotte's relationship with the violin was more intuitive and emotional. She seemed to understand the instrument's voice instinctively, quickly developing a feel for how to produce the sounds she heard in her imagination. While she was less interested in the theoretical aspects of music, she showed remarkable ability to play by ear and to express emotion through her violin playing. Professor Thompson adapted her teaching methods to suit each child's learning style. For George, she provided detailed explanations and structured exercises that built systematically on previous lessons. For Charlotte, she focused more on musical expression and encouraged experimentation, allowing her to explore the violin's capabilities while gradually introducing proper technique. By the end of their second month of lessons, both children had made remarkable progress. George could play simple classical pieces and was beginning to learn basic improvisation. Charlotte had mastered several folk melodies and was starting to work on more complex bowing techniques that would allow her to tackle more challenging repertoire. The transformation in both children was noticeable beyond their musical abilities. George, who had sometimes struggled with patience in his academic studies, found that the discipline required for piano practice helped him develop better focus in all areas of his learning. Charlotte, who had always been energetic and sometimes restless, discovered that playing violin provided an outlet for her emotions and helped her develop greater self-control. Catherine and William were impressed not only by their children's musical progress, but also by the positive changes they observed in their behavior and attitude. Both children seemed more confident, more focused, and more willing to tackle challenges in all aspects of their lives. The success of the music lessons led to discussions about expanding the children's musical education. Professor Thompson suggested that both children might benefit from exposure to different musical styles and perhaps opportunities to play with other young musicians. She also recommended that they begin to explore ensemble playing, starting with simple duets between the piano and violin. These early months of musical education were laying the groundwork for something much larger than anyone had initially imagined. Neither the children nor their parents could have predicted that these simple weekly lessons would eventually lead to performances on some of Britain's most prestigious stages. The foundation was being built, note by note, lesson by lesson, for a musical journey that would challenge, inspire, and ultimately transform two young royals into accomplished musicians who would capture the hearts of audiences across the nation and beyond. By September 2024, 6 months after their first music lesson, both Prince George and Princess Charlotte had progressed far beyond Professor Thompson's initial expectations. Their weekly lessons had expanded to twice-weekly sessions, and both children spent at least an hour each day practicing their instruments. The quiet music room at Kensington Palace had become their sanctuary, where they could escape the formal demands of royal life and lose themselves in the world of music. George had developed into a serious young pianist with impressive technical skills. His repertoire now included pieces by Mozart, Bach, and Chopin, adapted for his skill level, but maintaining their musical integrity. He had also begun composing simple melodies of his own, showing creativity that surprised even Professor Thompson. His understanding of music theory continued to grow, and he often asked questions that challenged his teacher to explain complex concepts in ways an 11-year-old could understand. Charlotte's violin playing had blossomed with remarkable speed. Her natural ear for music allowed her to pick up melodies quickly, and her emotional connection to the instrument produced sounds that moved everyone who heard her play. She had mastered basic vibrato technique and was working on more advanced bowing patterns that would allow her to express greater musical nuance. Her favorite pieces were folk melodies and simple classical works that allowed her to showcase the violin's singing quality. The first major challenge came in October when Catherine and William were invited to attend a charity concert at the Royal Albert Hall. The event was being organized to raise funds for music education in underprivileged schools, a cause that was particularly close to Catherine's heart. During the planning discussions, someone mentioned that the royal children were taking music lessons, and the organizers tentatively suggested that perhaps they might consider performing a short piece. The suggestion created immediate tension within the family. Catherine and William were protective of their children's privacy and concerned about placing them in a high-pressure public performance situation. They had always tried to keep their children's activities as normal as possible, away from intense media scrutiny. A performance at such a prestigious venue would inevitably attract significant attention and criticism. George and Charlotte had mixed reactions when their parents discussed the possibility with them. George was terrified at the thought of performing in front of hundreds of people, particularly knowing that his performance would be analyzed and critiqued by media outlets worldwide. Charlotte, surprisingly, seemed more interested in the opportunity, though she was concerned about making mistakes in such an important setting. Professor Thompson was consulted about whether the children were ready for such a performance. Her assessment was honest and thorough. Technically, both children had the skills to perform simple pieces successfully. Emotionally and psychologically, however, she was concerned about the pressure such exposure might place on them. She recommended that if they did choose to perform, it should be a very brief appearance, perhaps a simple duet that they had been working on together. The decision process took several weeks. Catherine and William consulted with palace advisors, child psychologists, and music education experts. They wanted to ensure that any decision would be in their children's best interests, not driven by external pressures or expectations. The children themselves were included in these discussions, with their parents explaining both the opportunities and risks involved in such a public performance. During this period of uncertainty, both children continued their regular lessons and practice sessions. Professor Thompson noticed that the possibility of performing had affected them differently. George became more focused and perfectionist in his practice, sometimes becoming frustrated when he made small mistakes. Charlotte seemed more relaxed, but also more experimental, trying new techniques and interpretations that she hadn't attempted before. The breakthrough came during a November lesson when Professor Thompson suggested they work on a simple arrangement of the Sky Boat song, a traditional Scottish melody that could feature both piano and violin. As they began working on the piece together, something magical happened. Their individual musical voices blended beautifully, creating a sound that was greater than the sum of its parts. George's steady, thoughtful piano accompaniment provided the perfect foundation for Charlotte's expressive violin melody. Watching her children play together, Catherine realized that their music had become more than just an individual skill or hobby. It had become a way for them to communicate with each other and express emotions that they might struggle to put into words. The decision was made that they would accept the invitation to perform, but with strict conditions about the duration, format, and media coverage of their appearance. The next 6 weeks were intensive preparation for what would be the children's first public performance. Professor Thompson worked with them daily, focusing not just on the technical aspects of their performance, but also on performance skills, stage presence, and managing performance anxiety. They practiced playing while people watched, starting with just palace staff and gradually including more observers. George struggled initially with performance nerves, sometimes making mistakes during run-throughs that he never made during private practice. Professor Thompson worked with him on breathing techniques and mental preparation strategies. She helped him understand that small mistakes were natural and that the audience would appreciate the courage and effort rather than expecting perfection. Charlotte adapted more quickly to performing for others, though she had her own challenges. Her natural tendency to experiment with the music sometimes led her to deviate from the planned arrangement during practice sessions. Professor Thompson helped her learn to balance creativity with consistency, ensuring that their performance would be reliable while still maintaining its emotional impact. The media attention leading up to the concert was intense, despite the palace's efforts to keep the focus on the charitable cause rather than the children's performance. Music critics, royal watchers, and the general public all speculated about what the children would play and how they would perform. The pressure was unlike anything George and Charlotte had experienced before. 2 weeks before the performance, Charlotte experienced what Professor Thompson recognized as performance anxiety. She became reluctant to practice, complained of stomach aches before lessons, and several times suggested that perhaps they shouldn't perform after all. It was a crucial moment that tested everyone's commitment to the project. Catherine spent long hours talking with Charlotte about her fears and concerns. They discussed how everyone feels nervous before important events, and that courage isn't the absence of fear, but rather choosing to act despite being afraid. Charlotte eventually confided that she was mostly worried about disappointing people or being laughed at if she made mistakes. The solution came from an unexpected source. George, who had been dealing with his own performance anxiety, suggested that they were doing the performance together, so they could support each other. He promised Charlotte that if she made a mistake, he would keep playing to help her recover, and she promised the same for him. This mutual support pact seemed to ease both children's concerns and strengthen their partnership. The final week of preparation included dress rehearsals in the palace's largest formal room, which approximated the scale of the performance venue. The children practiced walking on stage, bowing to the audience, and managing their instruments in a formal setting. They also worked with the palace's media team to understand what to expect from photographers and television cameras. Professor Thompson was impressed by both children's growth during this challenging period. George had learned to manage his perfectionist tendencies and had developed greater confidence in his abilities. Charlotte had learned to channel her performance energy more effectively while maintaining her natural musical expressiveness. Both had demonstrated remarkable resilience in dealing with pressure and uncertainty. The day before the performance, both children seemed calmer and more focused than they had been in weeks. They ran through their piece one final time, and Professor Thompson felt confident that they were as ready as they could possibly be. The performance itself would be brief, just 4 minutes long, but it represented months of hard work, personal growth, and musical development. Catherine and William were proud of how their children had handled the preparation process. They had seen George and Charlotte mature significantly over the past few months, developing not just musical skills, but also courage, perseverance, and mutual support. Regardless of how the actual performance went, they knew that their children had already achieved something remarkable. The stage was set for what would become a defining moment in both children's lives, though none of them could have predicted the extraordinary chain of events that this first performance would set in motion. December 3rd, 2024, arrived with an early morning frost that made the windows of Kensington Palace sparkle in the weak winter sunlight. Prince George woke before his alarm, his stomach fluttering with nervous energy. Down the hall, Princess Charlotte had been awake for an hour, quietly humming the melody they would perform later that evening. Today was the day of their first public performance at the Royal Albert Hall. The morning routine was deliberately kept normal to help both children stay calm. They attended their regular lessons, had lunch with their parents, and even managed to fit in their usual afternoon walk through the palace gardens. However, the underlying tension was palpable. Palace staff moved more quietly than usual, and Catherine checked on both children multiple times throughout the day, offering encouragement and reassurance. Professor Thompson arrived at 3 o'clock for a final rehearsal. She had deliberately kept this session brief and light, focusing on helping the children feel confident rather than attempting any last-minute improvements. Both George and Charlotte played through their piece, the Sky Boat Song, with remarkable composure. Their months of preparation were evident in every note, and Professor Thompson felt a surge of pride watching her young students demonstrate such skill and musicality. The journey to the Royal Albert Hall began at 4:30. Both children traveled with their parents in the official car, with Professor Thompson following in a separate vehicle along with the children's instruments. George was unusually quiet during the drive, his hands folded in his lap as he mentally rehearsed the piece. Charlotte kept looking out the window, watching London pass by, and occasionally asking questions about the venue and the other performers. Arriving at the Royal Albert Hall was overwhelming for both children, despite their preparation. The building's imposing Victorian architecture, the crowds of people arriving for the concert, and the photographers waiting outside all contributed to the sense that this was a momentous occasion. Security arrangements whisked the family through a private entrance, but not before both children got a glimpse of the excitement their presence had generated. The backstage area of the Royal Albert Hall was a maze of corridors, dressing rooms, and practice spaces filled with professional musicians preparing for the evening's performance. George and Charlotte were given a quiet room where they could warm up and have a few moments to collect themselves before the show began. Professor Thompson stayed with them, providing calm reassurance and helping them focus on their music rather than the surrounding chaos. At 6 o'clock, they were taken to see the concert hall from the performer's perspective. Standing on the famous stage and looking out at the nearly 6,000 seats was breathtaking and terrifying for both children. George gripped Charlotte's hand as they stood together, both suddenly comprehending the scale of what they were about to attempt. Charlotte whispered that it looked much bigger than she had imagined, while George commented quietly that there seemed to be an enormous number of people already taking their seats. The concert began at 7:30 with a full orchestra performing pieces by British composers. George and Charlotte watched from the wings, fascinated by the coordination and skill of the professional musicians. Seeing the orchestra in action helped them understand their own performance and context. They were part of an evening celebrating music education and the importance of supporting young musicians across the country. Their performance was scheduled as the final piece before the interval, a placement that honored their special status while avoiding the pressure of being the evening's climax. As the orchestra finished the piece before theirs, Professor Thompson led both children through final preparations. She checked that George's piano bench was at the correct height, ensured that Charlotte's violin was properly tuned, and reminded them both of the breathing techniques they had practiced for managing performance nerves. Catherine and William were seated in the royal box, where they could clearly see their children, but also provide moral support through their visible presence. Both parents were more nervous than they had anticipated, understanding better than ever the courage their children were demonstrating by choosing to perform in such a public forum. The moment arrived with surprising suddenness. The orchestra conductor, Sir James Morrison, walked to the microphone to introduce the young performers. He spoke warmly about the evening's charitable purpose and the importance of music education, then invited Prince George and Princess Charlotte to the stage. The audience's applause was warm and encouraging as both children walked carefully to their positions. George sat at the grand piano, adjusting his position and taking a moment to center himself before placing his hands on the keys. Charlotte stood beside the piano with her violin, her bow held ready, and her posture reflecting months of careful instruction. They looked at each other, sharing a brief smile that communicated their mutual support and readiness to begin. The opening notes of the Sky Boat song filled the concert hall with surprising clarity and confidence. George's piano introduction was steady and musical, establishing the gentle, flowing rhythm that would carry the entire piece. When Charlotte's violin entered with the main melody, something magical happened that transcended the technical aspects of their performance. The audience, which had been politely attentive, became genuinely engaged as they heard the children's interpretation of the beloved Scottish tune. Charlotte's violin sang with an emotional maturity that belied her young age, while George's accompaniment provided sensitive support that enhanced rather than competed with the melody. Their musical communication was evident. They listened to each other, responded to subtle changes in timing and dynamics, and created a unified musical statement. The middle section of the piece featured a brief solo passage for Charlotte's violin, during which George's accompaniment became more sparse, allowing the violin's voice to soar above gentle piano harmonies. This was the moment that many in the audience later described as particularly moving. Hearing a 9-year-old express such musical sensitivity and technical control while performing in one of the world's most prestigious concert halls. The final section brought both instruments together in a rich, harmonized statement of the melody that demonstrated how much both children had learned about ensemble playing. Their timing was perfect, their musical balance well judged, and their emotional commitment to the music obvious to everyone listening. As they approached the final phrase, both children seemed to grow in confidence, delivering the concluding notes with authority and grace. The silence that followed their final notes lasted just long enough to be meaningful before the audience erupted in enthusiastic applause. The ovation continued for nearly 2 minutes, with people throughout the concert hall rising to their feet to acknowledge the children's achievement. George and Charlotte stood together, bowing as they had practiced, their faces showing relief, pride, and genuine surprise at the warmth of the audience's response. As they left the stage, both children were beaming with excitement and accomplishment. The performance had exceeded everyone's expectations, including their own. Professor Thompson was waiting in the wings with tears in her eyes, proud beyond words of what her students had achieved. Catherine and William hurried backstage to embrace their children, their own emotions running high after witnessing such a remarkable moment. The immediate aftermath of the performance was overwhelming in the best possible way. Musicians from the orchestra came to congratulate George and Charlotte, offering genuine praise for their musicianship and stage presence. Several audience members approached them during the interval to express their appreciation, and the concert organizers were effusive in their thanks for the children's contribution to the evening. Media coverage of the performance began almost immediately, with social media posts and news reports describing the children's performance in glowing terms. Music critics who had been skeptical about featuring such young performers were unanimous in their praise for the children's technical skill and musical sensitivity. The performance had succeeded beyond anyone's hopes, establishing both George and Charlotte as genuine young musicians rather than merely royal curiosities. The drive home from the Royal Albert Hall was filled with excited conversation as both children relived their performance and shared their feelings about the experience. George admitted that his nerves had disappeared as soon as he started playing, while Charlotte said that performing for such a large audience had been the most exciting thing she had ever done. Professor Thompson joined the family for a late dinner at the palace, where they continued to discuss the evening's events. She was already thinking about future opportunities for the children, recognizing that their successful debut performance had opened doors that hadn't existed before. Both children expressed interest in performing again, though they also wanted to continue developing their individual skills and exploring new musical challenges. The success of their Royal Albert Hall debut marked a turning point in both children's musical journeys. They had proven to themselves, their families, and the public that they were serious young musicians capable of delivering meaningful performances under pressure. More importantly, they had discovered that sharing their music with others brought joy not just to audiences, but to themselves as performers. What none of them could have anticipated was how this single performance would lead to opportunities and challenges that would test their commitment to music in ways they had never imagined. The success of their debut was just the beginning of a musical adventure that would take them far beyond anything they had previously dreamed possible. The weeks following the Royal Albert Hall performance brought an unexpected flood of attention and opportunities that would reshape George and Charlotte's musical education entirely. Letters arrived daily at Kensington Palace from music schools, youth orchestras, and concert organizers across Britain and beyond. Professional musicians who had heard about their performance reached out through official channels, offering mentorship and collaboration opportunities. Sir David Richardson, the artistic director of the London Youth Symphony Orchestra, was among the first to make contact. He had been in the audience that December evening and had been genuinely impressed by both children's musical maturity and stage presence. 3 days after the concert, he formally invited both George and Charlotte to audition for positions in the orchestra's advanced program, an opportunity typically reserved for teenagers who had been studying music for many years. Catherine and William were initially hesitant about this invitation. They worried that joining a youth orchestra might place too much pressure on their children or interfere with their regular education and royal responsibilities. However, after consulting with Professor Thompson and observing their children's continued enthusiasm for music, they agreed to allow George and Charlotte to attend an informal meeting with Sir David to discuss what participation might involve. The meeting took place at the London Youth Symphony Orchestra's headquarters in South Kensington on a cold January morning in 2025. Both children were nervous but excited as they entered the building that housed one of Britain's most prestigious youth music organizations. Sir David welcomed them personally, giving them a tour of the rehearsal rooms and explaining how the orchestra operated. What impressed Sir David most during this visit was not the children's royal status, but their genuine curiosity about music and their respectful attitude toward the other young musicians they met. George asked thoughtful questions about orchestral arrangements and how different instruments work together, while Charlotte was fascinated by watching older students practice challenging pieces on various instruments. The audition process was adapted to accommodate the children's unique circumstances and security requirements. Rather than a formal audition with multiple judges, Professor Thompson worked with Sir David to arrange private sessions where both children could demonstrate their current abilities and potential for growth. George played several pieces that showcased his technical skills and musical understanding, while Charlotte performed works that highlighted her natural expressiveness and developing technique. Both children exceeded expectations during these sessions. George's sight-reading skills were particularly impressive for his age, and his ability to adapt his playing style to complement other instruments suggested he would work well in an ensemble setting. Charlotte's musical instincts and emotional connection to her violin playing indicated significant potential for artistic growth within an orchestral environment. Sir David's recommendation was that both children should join the orchestra's preparatory program, which would allow them to participate in sectional rehearsals and educational workshops while gradually building toward full orchestra participation. This approach would provide them with valuable ensemble experience without overwhelming them with the demands of the full program. The decision to join the London Youth Symphony Orchestra required significant adjustments to both children's schedules and the family security arrangements. Rehearsals were held twice weekly in the evenings, with additional weekend sessions when preparing for performances. The palace security team had to coordinate with the orchestra's management to ensure the children's safety without disrupting the musical activities. George and Charlotte's first rehearsal in February 2025 was a milestone that marked their transition from individual music students to ensemble musicians. Walking into a room filled with talented young people aged 8 to 18, all focused on creating music together, was inspiring and slightly intimidating for both royal children. The orchestra's conductor, Elena Martinez, had worked with young musicians for over 20 years and was skilled at integrating new members regardless of their background or experience level. She paired George with an experienced pianist who could guide him through the ensemble playing techniques he would need to master. Charlotte was placed in the second violin section, where she could learn from more advanced players while contributing at her own skill level. The first piece they worked on together was Mozart's Symphony No. 40, adapted for youth orchestra. George found himself challenged by the precision required for orchestral piano parts, where his individual expression had to serve a larger musical structure. Charlotte discovered that violin playing in an orchestra required different skills than solo performance, particularly the ability to blend her sound with other string players while maintaining her own musical voice. Both children struggled initially with aspects of orchestral playing that hadn't been part of their individual instruction. George had to learn to follow a conductor's tempo and dynamics rather than setting his own musical pace. Charlotte found it challenging to play with such precise timing while surrounded by other musicians, all of whom had to coordinate their individual parts to create a unified sound. Elena Martinez was impressed by both children's willingness to learn and their respectful attitude toward their fellow musicians. She noticed that neither George nor Charlotte expected special treatment because of their royal status, and both worked hard to earn their places in the orchestra through musical merit alone. Their fellow orchestra members, after an initial period of curiosity about having royal children in their ensemble, came to accept them simply as dedicated young musicians. The first major test of their orchestral skills came in April 2025, when the orchestra was invited to perform at the Thames Festival, a celebration of London's cultural heritage held annually along the South Bank. This would be George and Charlotte's first performance as part of a larger ensemble, and the pressure was considerable given the public attention their participation would inevitably attract. Preparation for the Thames Festival performance required intensive rehearsals throughout March and early April. Both children had to balance their orchestra commitments with their regular education and royal responsibilities, a challenge that tested their time management skills and dedication to music. There were times when they felt overwhelmed by the demands of their schedule, but their commitment to their fellow musicians motivated them to persevere. George's role in the orchestra had evolved significantly by this time. His technical skills and musical understanding had impressed Elena Martinez enough that she gave him several solo passages within the orchestral arrangements. These moments required him to step forward as a featured performer while maintaining his supportive role within the ensemble, a balance that challenged his musical and personal growth. Charlotte had become an integral part of the violin section, her natural musicality and improving technique contributing to the section's overall sound quality. Her fellow violinists had come to appreciate not only her musical contributions, but also her positive attitude and willingness to help newer members of the section learn their parts. The Thames Festival performance took place on a beautiful Saturday afternoon in April, with the orchestra performing on an outdoor stage overlooking the Thames. The setting was informal compared to traditional concert halls, but the audience of several thousand people and the media attention created significant pressure for all the young performers. George and Charlotte's families were present, along with representatives from various musical organizations who had become interested in the children's development. Professor Thompson watched from the audience with a mixture of pride and nervousness, recognizing how far her students had progressed since their first tentative lessons just over a year earlier. The performance itself was a triumph for the entire orchestra. The months of preparation were evident in the precision and musicality of their playing, and the outdoor setting seemed to liberate the young musicians to perform with greater freedom and expression than might have been possible in a formal concert hall. George's solo passages were delivered with confidence and sensitivity, while Charlotte's contribution to the violin section helped create some of the most beautiful moments in the orchestral arrangements. The audience response was enthusiastic and sustained, with the orchestra receiving a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. For George and Charlotte, performing as part of this talented ensemble was more rewarding than their previous solo performance had been, despite receiving less individual attention. They had discovered the unique satisfaction that comes from contributing to a musical result that is greater than any individual performer could achieve alone. Following the Thames Festival success, invitations for the orchestra increased significantly, with several requesting that George and Charlotte be featured as soloists within the orchestral performances. Elena Martinez was careful to ensure that any such opportunities served the children's musical development rather than exploiting their royal status for publicity purposes. The summer of 2025 brought an unexpected opportunity that would prove to be the most significant in both children's musical development to date. Sir James Morrison, the conductor who had introduced them at their Royal Albert Hall debut, contacted the palace with a proposal that would challenge George and Charlotte in ways they had never experienced before. Sir James was planning a special concert series featuring young British musicians, and he wanted George and Charlotte not just to perform, but to help lead one of the concerts. His vision was for them to conduct portions of the performance while also serving as featured soloists, a combination that would require them to develop entirely new musical skills while demonstrating leadership abilities they had never been asked to use before. The proposal was ambitious and somewhat daunting. Neither child had any conducting experience, and the idea of leading professional musicians seemed almost impossible to imagine. However, Sir James was convinced that both children had the musical understanding and personal presence necessary to succeed in this challenging role, provided they received proper preparation and support. This opportunity would require a level of commitment and preparation that went far beyond anything George and Charlotte had previously undertaken. It would also place them in a position of musical leadership that would test not only their individual skills, but also their ability to inspire and guide other musicians toward a shared artistic vision. The proposal from Sir James Morrison to have George and Charlotte serve as young conductors marked the beginning of the most intensive period of musical education either child had ever experienced. The concert was scheduled for October 2025, giving them 6 months to develop conducting skills that typically took years to master. Both children would need to learn not only the technical aspects of conducting, but also the leadership qualities necessary to guide professional musicians through complex musical works. Master conductor Wilhelm Richter was brought in from Vienna specifically to work with George and Charlotte on their conducting preparation. At 73 years old, Professor Richter had spent 5 decades conducting orchestras around the world and had developed a reputation for his ability to teach young musicians the art of musical leadership. His first meeting with the children in June 2025 would determine whether Sir James's ambitious vision was achievable. Professor Richter's initial assessment was both encouraging and sobering. He recognized immediately that both children possessed strong musical instincts and excellent ears for orchestral balance and timing. However, he also understood that conducting required physical skills, musical knowledge, and personal authority that would challenge them in completely new ways. George's analytical approach to music would serve him well in studying orchestral scores, while Charlotte's intuitive musicality would help her communicate expression and emotion to the musicians. The conducting lessons began with basic baton technique and score reading. George approached these new skills with his characteristic thoroughness, practicing baton patterns for hours and studying orchestral scores with the same intensity he had once applied to piano technique. Charlotte initially found the physical aspects of conducting awkward and artificial, preferring to express musical ideas through natural gestures rather than formal conducting patterns. Professor Richter adapted his teaching methods to work with each child's strengths while addressing their individual challenges. For George, he emphasized the expressive aspects of conducting, helping him understand how physical gestures could communicate musical emotion as effectively as technical precision. For Charlotte, he focused on developing consistent technique that would allow her natural expressiveness to be clearly understood by orchestra musicians. The piece selected for their conducting debut was Grieg's Peer Gynt's Suite, specifically in the Hall of the Mountain King and Morning Mood. These works offered opportunities for both dramatic, energetic conducting and subtle, lyrical leadership. The music was familiar to audiences while providing sufficient challenge to showcase the children's developing skills as young conductors. July and August 2025 were dominated by intensive preparation sessions. 3 times each week, George and Charlotte worked with Professor Richter on conducting technique, score analysis, and rehearsal leadership skills. They also continued their individual instrumental practice and their participation in the London Youth Symphony Orchestra, maintaining their development as performers while adding the new dimension of conducting study. The first major test of their conducting skills came in September when they were given the opportunity to lead sectional rehearsals with members of the London Symphony Orchestra. Working with professional musicians for the first time as conductors was both thrilling and terrifying for both children. The musicians were patient and supportive, but they also expected clear musical direction and competent leadership. George's first rehearsal with the string section went smoothly largely because of his thorough preparation and clear communication of musical ideas. His baton technique was still developing, but his understanding of the music and his respectful approach to working with professional musicians earned their cooperation and respect. He successfully guided the section through several challenging passages, making helpful suggestions about phrasing and dynamics. Charlotte's initial experience conducting the woodwind section was more challenging. Her natural enthusiasm and expressive conducting style initially confused some musicians who were accustomed to more traditional conducting approaches. However, when she relaxed and allowed her musical instincts to guide her gestures, the results were remarkably effective. The musicians responded to her energy and emotional connection to the music, producing playing that was both technically precise and musically compelling. These early rehearsal experiences taught both children important lessons about musical leadership. They learned that conducting was not about imposing their will on the musicians, but rather about facilitating the best possible musical performance from talented individuals who shared their commitment to excellence. They also discovered that their youth could be an advantage, bringing fresh energy and perspectives to familiar musical works. Professor Thompson continued to work with both children throughout this period, helping them maintain their individual instrumental skills while supporting their conducting development. She was amazed by how much they had grown as musicians and as individuals since their first tentative lessons 18 months earlier. Their confidence, musical understanding, and ability to work with others had developed dramatically. The final month of preparation included full orchestra rehearsals with George and Charlotte sharing conducting duties for different sections of the Grieg suite. These sessions were observed by Sir James Morrison and other musical professionals who would be involved in the October concert. The consensus was that both children had exceeded all expectations and were ready for their conducting debut. October 15th, 2025, arrived with perfect autumn weather and an atmosphere of excitement that had been building for weeks. The concert venue was the Barbican Centre, one of London's most prestigious concert halls, and tickets had sold out within hours of going on sale. The program featured the London Symphony Orchestra with George and Charlotte as guest conductors, supported by established conductor Sir James Morrison, who would lead portions of the evening and provide guidance as needed. Both children arrived at the Barbican in the afternoon for final rehearsals and sound checks. They were noticeably more confident than they had been before their previous public performances, having learned to channel their nervous energy into focused preparation rather than anxiety. George spent time reviewing his scores one final time, while Charlotte warmed up with conducting exercises that had become routine over the past months. The evening concert began with Sir James conducting the orchestra in an overture, allowing both the musicians and the audience to settle into the performance atmosphere. George and Charlotte watched from the wings, observing how Sir James communicated with the orchestra and managed the energy of the performance. George was the first to take the podium, conducting Morning Mood from the Peer Gynt suite. As he raised his baton and the orchestra began the gentle, flowing opening of Grieg's masterpiece, something remarkable happened. The young prince seemed to grow in stature and authority, his clear gestures guiding the orchestra through one of classical music's most beautiful morning songs. His interpretation was both technically competent and musically sensitive, drawing playing from the LSO that captured both the technical precision and emotional warmth of the music. The audience response to George's conducting was immediate and enthusiastic. They recognized not just technical competence, but genuine musical leadership from someone barely 13 years old. Professional musicians in the orchestra later commented that George had conducted with clarity and musical understanding that belied his age and experience. Charlotte followed within the Hall of the Mountain King, a piece that perfectly suited her energetic conducting style and natural sense of drama. From the mysterious quiet opening through the building intensity to the explosive climax, she guided the orchestra with gestures that were both technically sound and dramatically compelling. Her face reflected every emotional moment in the music, and the orchestra responded with playing that was exciting and precisely controlled. The climax of Charlotte's conducting was electrifying, with the full orchestra building to the thunderous conclusion of Grieg's famous piece under the direction of a 10-year-old princess whose musical passion and leadership had inspired professional musicians to deliver one of their finest performances. The audience erupted in applause that continued for several minutes, acknowledging both the musical achievement and the remarkable courage of such young conductors. The concert concluded with both children conducting together, sharing the podium for a specially arranged version of Rule Britannia that featured both orchestral and choral forces. This final piece allowed them to demonstrate their ability to work together as musical partners while leading a large ensemble through a stirring conclusion to an unforgettable evening. As they took their final bows together, George and Charlotte held hands and acknowledged the standing ovation with the grace and humility that had characterized their entire musical journey. They had achieved something extraordinary, but more importantly, they had discovered that their love for music could inspire others and bring joy to audiences who shared their appreciation for the power of musical expression. The success of the Barbican concert established George and Charlotte as serious young musicians who had earned respect through talent, hard work, and dedication rather than merely through their royal status. Offers for future performances arrived immediately, but Catherine and William were careful to ensure that any commitments would continue to serve their children's musical development rather than overwhelming them with expectations. Professor Thompson, watching from the audience that evening, reflected on how far her students had traveled from their first tentative piano and violin lessons. They had become accomplished musicians, confident performers, and now successful conductors who could lead professional orchestras in major concert venues. More importantly, they had maintained their love for music and their respect for the collaborative nature of musical performance. The journey that began with simple weekly lessons had transformed into something that none of them could have anticipated. George and Charlotte had discovered not only their individual musical talents, but also their ability to inspire others and their capacity for leadership in the most collaborative of arts. Their story had become proof that with proper guidance, genuine commitment, and the courage to accept challenges, young people could achieve remarkable things while remaining true to themselves and their values. As they left the Barbican Center that evening, both children were already discussing future musical projects and continuing their development as musicians and conductors. Their success had opened doors to opportunities they were only beginning to imagine, and their love for music continued to grow with each new challenge they embraced. The royal children who had begun their musical journey with simple curiosity had become young artists whose talents and dedication promised even greater achievements in the years ahead.